Okay, so today we are talking about the Persian and Peloponnesian War. So first we're going to look at the Persian War. And it was a Persian War, but there were really two phases to the war. So the first was actually with Darius, who we've talked about. And then the next phase after Darius was Xerxes. And so Xerxes really took up what Darius started, but it was much larger scale under Xerxes. Darius was much more of an initial attempt, whereas Xerxes, you have the more all-out Persian War. So how it got started is that you had the Ionian city-states, which were Greek to a degree. The main Greeks saw them as relatives, and they were actually tributary states under the Persian Empire. And so remember, with tributary states and how Persia was structured, you had that with a tributary state, you provided money, and then you provided in taxes, right? And then you provided men for the military. On top of this, you also had satraps that were there to make sure that things went well, that the taxes were paid, that no one was planning on revolting. And so there was a satrap with the Ionian city-state. What happened with this is that the satrap did not do his job and helped convince the Ionian city-states to revolt. So the exact opposite of what he was supposed to do. He worked with them to revolt from the Persian Empire. Now, we saw this before, right? The Persian rule overall was pretty good. They were pretty tolerant, and they tended to allow you religious, cultural, and even political practices under their rule. Being under Persian as a tributary state wasn't really that bad of a thing, especially when you compare it to other societies and civilizations and how they had ruled before. But we did see that when cities revolted, then they were put down very harshly. We saw that with Darius and Babylon. So it should be no surprise with what was coming that the Ionians are not going to fare well, and that the Persians are going to respond to this. So the Ionians knew that this was coming, and so what they did is that they actually appealed to the other Greek city-states, specifically to Sparta and Athens, which were two of the most powerful in the region. Sparta was basically like, yeah, no thanks. And Athens was like, well, we feel like we have some obligation to help you out, but we don't really want to get involved. So what they ended up doing is they gave them 20 ships. They said, yeah, we're not going to fight with you. We're not going to defend. But here, we'll give you some ships, since we kind of feel like there's this obligation to help. Well, that wasn't enough to have them be successful. Not surprisingly, Persia wins. And with them winning, they destroyed the city, the main city that revolted, or that started the revolt. And they didn't just destroy the city, they burned it to the ground. They killed a lot of the men that fought. and enslaved everyone else. So they killed if they killed them, I suppose you aren't enslaving them, or enslaved entire population of the original city that started this whole thing. So, and then that was, just like with Babylon, right? It was meant to make a point to try to prevent other rebellions and revolts. Like, Persia will be lenient with you if you follow the rules. If you revolt, there's a lot worse consequences, so it's not worth it. And again, Persia, because of, if we go look at this tributary structure, they end up being extremely wealthy and the largest military in the world at the time. So this makes it hard to fight against, right? Their whole system and the tributary system sets it up to have them be in a position to be extremely successful that way. Well, the consequence and why the Ionian revolt was important is that then this puts Athens and Greece in the spotlight as Darius begins to feel that Persia was never going to have peace within that region if the mainland Greece was not occupied. And of course, so that means if they're not going to have peace without mainland Greece being occupied, you're going to go try to conquer them. Now, it's not to say that he didn't want that in the first place. It was certainly a good excuse and justification to use it. But it did make sure that it happened. Whereas if the Athenians hadn't helped out, then he might not have had that justification to go ahead and do so. And you do need some justification. I mean, even with powerful empires, there often is this connection of feeling like you have to have some kind of justification for why you're doing it. Even if you're going to do it anyways, it makes people around you feel better that you aren't just conquering whoever, whenever, without a specific cause. And so, yes, there was a desire to take Greece and incorporate them into the Persian Empire. At the same time, he was angry that the Athenians helped out with ships and felt that they would continue. Specifically, what he saw is this idea of Athens and probably a connection to democracy, and that this was going to create continued agitation with the Ionians and potentially others around, whereas if they conquered them, then that would be the end of that. So that gets us to the first really battle within the Persian Wars, the Battle of Marathon. And he does go after Athens first, again, because they're the ones that helped provide the ships. However, he does send envoys to both Sparta and Persia. So it does show that it's not Sparta and Persia, Sparta and Athens. It does show that there were plans to go beyond Athens, even if the Battle of Marathon was the first battle. So the story goes, now we know most of the information. There's a couple of sources, but Herodotus was a Greek historian who wrote a lot about this. And what he wrote has to be taken with a grain of salt, because it very much portrayed Greece and Athens and Sparta as the beacons of goodness and justice, and Persia as evil, horrible tyrants. And we know that the way that Persia is described in Herodotus' histories is not accurate. It's definitely coming from an Athenian perspective. A Greek perspective as them as the big bad evil force, and the Greeks as the good honest individuals. But he has in the story that the Athens were or envoys were sent to Sparta and Athens, and the envoys of Persia because they were the two powerhouses and they were the holdouts. So that if they agreed to submit, then the other smaller city-states probably would have as well. At least that's what Persia had hoped. And so what they supposedly asked for was earth and water, the Persian envoys of Sparta and Athens, which was meant to be tokens of submission. Right, you show that you're going to be, and they try to convince them and say, look, it's going to be, under our empire, your life isn't going to change much. Yes, you're going to owe tribute and you're going to have to submit to the Persian king, Darius, but, you know, we allow you to live your life and continue to do the things. Now, the story, and again, this taken with a grain of salt, that this was almost certainly exaggerated, but it sounds awesome, is that the Athenians, in response to the envoy, their response was to throw the Persian in messengers into a pit and told them to dig their own earth. And then in Sparta, it was that, of course, then they responded with the water. So the story was in Sparta that they pushed them into a well and said, collect your own water. Now, the movie 300 takes that idea and showcases it a little bit more creatively. So again, we're going to look at this clip just because it's fun, and it highlights, well, one, it gives a little clue of like Spartan culture with women and the queen's response, which they did believe that was true. But it also is just taking this story and that probably didn't happen this way. We do know from some of the descriptions that the envoys were not treated well. So while the story is most likely not true, the Persians' messengers were not treated well. And this just further pissed off Darius in the process. So the clip we're going to watch, don't take this as historical fact. Take it as something that is a fun response that Herodotus wrote because it makes them sound heroic. It makes them, it's a great way of like sounding story of, yeah, when the evil big bad Persians sent their messengers, we responded, you know, by this kind of poetic throwing them in and get your own earth, get your own water, to showcase how Sparta and Athens supported and wanted freedom and was not willing to submit. And so, but this is going to lead to the poor interaction between the envoys, and that, along with, of course, the fact that the Athenians gave this ship, leads directly to the Battle of Marathon. So let's just watch this clip from 300 real quick, and then we will look at what happened at the actual Battle of Marathon.
What message do you bring? Earth and water. You rode all the way from Persia for earth and water.
Do not be coy or stupid, Persian. You can afford neither in Sparta.
What makes this woman think she can speak among men?
Because only Spartan women give birth to real men.
Let us walk to cool our tongues. If you value your lives over your complete annihilation, listen carefully, Leonidas. Xerxes conquers and controls everything he rests his eyes upon. He leads an army so massive it shakes the ground with its march, so vast it drinks the rivers dry. All the god King Xerxes requires is this, a simple offering of earth and water, a token of Sparta's submission to to the will of Xerxes.
Submission. Now that's a bit of a problem. See, rumor has it the Athenians have already turned you down. And if those philosophers and boy lovers found that kind of nerve, then...
We must be diplomatic.
And of course, Spartans have their reputation to consider.
Choose your next words carefully, Leonidas. They may be your last as king. Madman. You're a madman.
Air and water. Well, you'll find plenty of both down there.
No man, Persian or Greek, no man threatens a messenger.
You bring the crowns and heads of conquered kings to my city steps. You insult my queen. You threaten my people with slavery and death. Oh, I've chosen my words carefully, Persian. Perhaps you should have done the same.
This is blasphemy. This is madness.
Madness. This is Sparta!
You can speak among men.
Okay, so they also mixed up, right, and just had to be Xerxes. They kind of erased Darius from the story. But again, it looks more epic, right? If this idea of that they had this witty retort to earth and water as a aspect of submission. But so okay, so that's again, it wasn't Xerxes. The movie is just making it. They make the whole thing with Xerxes and kind of leave out the first part of the Persian War. Nonetheless, like I said, that was based off of, even with the movie, what Herodotus was reporting about with what happened that way. So with the end of any type of submission to Persian rule, the Persian military under Darius's leadership heads to Marathon, and it was with a Marathon Hill to land to attack, and this is in off of Attica. And so the Athenians are preparing for battle, and they are looking to get help because, of course, now you have a massive Persian military coming to attack you. Okay, let's get that. There we go. So Marathon Hill is where the battle was going to take place. The Athenians send a runner to Sparta to ask for aid. And so he races to Sparta And when he gets there, Sparta says, sorry, we are in the middle of a religious, it was a religious festival, and we can't stop that right now and come. They said that they would come and help when the festival was over. And so the runner runs back to Athens and tells them we're on our own, which then they're kind of like, oh no, what are we going to do? Well, they end up surviving because of a general, Miltiades. I'm going to spell his name right here. And Miltiades was seen as a good general. And he ended up coming up with a brilliant strategy based on, of course, the fact that they were far outnumbered, because that was a huge problem, as the Athenians were outnumbered. As we talked about, the Persian military was far larger. And so, of course, they ran the risk of just being overtaken by sheer size, and they weren't going to get Persian support, so they were on their own. So the Persian fleet, one of the things that helped with this battle is that the Persian fleet essentially was landing in waves. So they did not have to deal with the whole army. They dealt with a portion of it. In fact, Darius wasn't even there yet. He was behind a ways. And so the goal was to fight and have a divisive victory before the rest of the military landed, so that it would hopefully persuade them to stop the attack and invasion before they really got all of their forces there. So what he did is that he created a new military tactic that used the Phalanx Formation, and changed it around a little bit. So the normal Phalanx Formation, you had the soldiers that lined up really close to each other, and so many deep, right? This was the regular Phalanx Formation. But this he knew wouldn't work with larger numbers. So what he did instead is that he made the sides stronger and put more hoplite soldiers on either side, and then had a weakened center, which sucked for the people in the middle, and then on both sides it was stronger, so that intentionally when the Persian soldiers broke through, they would break through into the middle here. Then the stronger sides could come around on either side and surround them. Right? And this is what happened. And it worked. They defeated and routed the Persian soldiers before Darius and the rest of the forces got there. In fact, when Darius's ship and the other soldiers were arriving, they saw before they landed that the battle was lost, and the remaining Persian soldiers had actually started to retreat. What happens from this is that Darius decides to sail on to Athens. And Miltiades sees this and realizes, well, crap, we have all of our soldiers here. We can't march faster than the ships. They're going to get to Athens, and there's going to be no one there to defend it. So Miltiades sends the runner again to Athens. Now, what's to warn the Athenians. And the runner is supposed to, what he's supposed to do is tell the Athenian citizens that anyone, any male that is, or even woman that can dress up, that is capable, that is actually was more like available, because he didn't have to do anything, to dress up in anything looking like a military uniform, and then taking any type of weapons or pitchforks, anything that could come from a distance that would appear like weapons, and line up near the beach, near the shore, right? And so from a distance, it would look like the hoplite soldiers, the Athenian army, was somehow already lined up and ready to go. And it worked. Like army already there. So, and what's amazing with that is that it worked in the sense that as the ship sailed by from a distance, it looked like the hoplite soldiers were there and ready to go. And so Darius called it off, and they went back home. So that was the first phase of the Persian War. Was very short. It was with Darius, and really was held off because of the brilliant strategy of Miltiades. So what's interesting with this story is where we get the marathon run. Right, the runner, he had to run quite a bit. He ran to Sparta and then ran back, and then had to run from Marathon Hill to Athens. The distance from Marathon Hill to Athens is the 26.2 miles it is for a marathon run today. So we run marathons. I don't, but people run marathons. Crazy people run marathons. It's a run that's in remembrance of a soldier who ran to warn Athens and saved Athens by giving them the early warning. Now, what's somewhat macabre about all that is that he died from exhaustion. He got to Athens, he relayed the message, and then he died. So you're running the marathon run in remembrance of a guy who died doing that run. Of course, he also run to Sparta and back before that. Nonetheless, it's a good reminder of the difficulty of that run, that the run was created in remembrance of a guy who died doing it. What's interesting with this afterwards is after the battle, the Spartans do show up. So they kept their word. Of course, it was after the battle had already happened. And they were impressed by, which is a big thing from Spartans, because remember, Spartans are the land hoplites. All of these, the Athens were hoplite soldiers too, but the Spartans were professional soldiers, right? The Athenians were not. Everyone else around there was, whatever else the profession and then a soldier. The Spartans, that's all they did. So they were just the superior elite hoplite forces compared to everyone else. And they even commented on that they were impressed with Miltiades. They said, oh, well, we didn't think you were going to make it. It's kind of like, oh, thanks, Sparta. Appreciate you showing up when you thought we'd all be dead by this point. So that's the battle. This, though, does lead to people who were convinced that Persia would come back. So there was, we'll say, preparations. There was a fear that while they had defeated Darius, that Persia would attempt another invasion. And in that case, they were correct. So they did create some preparation with the expectation that they needed to work together as a group rather than as individual city-states. Now, this is important because the reality is that in Greece, most city-states, they saw themselves as, they identified with their city-state. They weren't Greeks. We call them all Greeks now, and they didn't identify that way until the Persian Wars. The Persian Wars really created a more collective sense of Greek, what they called a Hellene. Right, it's where we get the word Hellenic from. But so this idea of being Hellenes and stuff was that, or Hellas, that generalized identity as Greeks. The first time that really comes about is the Persian Wars, because they have to work together, not only in preparation, but then once the second war happens, it really is us against them, and so it isn't, just Athens or Sparta against Persia. It's all of the Greeks against Persia, and so it does create a collective identity that didn't exist before. What they end up creating is the Hellenic League, and this will be a precursor to the Delian League that the Athenians create later when they really become an empire during the Peloponnesian Wars. The Hellenic League was set up, again, to prepare and agree that they needed to prepare to resist Persia. And to do that, their best bet was to not only form a coalition, but get materials and things ready. So Sparta was made the leader. They were designated the leader because they had the strongest army. And then Athens was tasked with building ships. So they basically just worked to their strengths of what they were good at. And the goal was to have enough ships to prepare enough of military so that they could hold against Persia. Then taxes were collected, and this was meant to go towards building ships, supplies, and things like that. And so, not surprisingly, you have the second phase of war, which is with Xerxes. When Darius dies, Xerxes takes over, and Xerxes, second phase of war. Xerxes decides that he wants to continue and take Greece, and so they have a specific plan, which you could put under the Hellenic League too. Is we'll say battle plan. They had created a series of plans of how to respond to an attack from Persia and what would be best. So Xerxes did start making his way through different areas in Greece, but there are a few key battles that I want to look at. We're not going to go look at the all the battles, but there's several key battles that allow them to be successful. So the first has to do with the Battle of Thermopylae, which I think is the most known one. And then we'll look at Battle of Salamis and Plataea. So the first main battle was meant to hold off the Persians for as long as possible. The goal was to give the Athenians enough time to finish building the ships, and hope that then they could move the battle to where they would be best suited to be successful. So while the battle was always intended to be a stall tactic, they had a second goal in mind, which was a naval battle. And both of these were meant to, again, give Athens time to continue building more ships, as well as direct the battle to where they wanted it to go. right? They had a specific location where they wanted it to go, and they were hoping that they could stall as well as have it go in the direction that they wanted. So from the beginning, there was a realization that the Battle of Thermopylae was a long shot. The other problem is that they actually originally meant to send around 10,000 soldiers to Thermopylae, but some fled when they saw the size of the Persian army. However, it wasn't just 300 Spartans that fought. There were other people. There was a total a number of Greeks that fought at this battle was around 6,000 to 7,000 soldiers. Now, from that, you do have 300 Spartans. So there were other, the movie, right, in 300, they do show the Athenians there briefly, but they kind of make it look like only the Spartans fought. There were others that fought. However, the other Greeks are going to retreat when it becomes clear that they're going to lose, and the Spartans are going to stay. And part of that is because the Spartans were not big on surrendering. We saw that with the Spartan creed and that idea that you came back with your shield or on it, meaning you either won the battle or you died. And so the Spartans didn't like to retreat. Leonidas was the king that we saw in the movie at the time, and because he knew that this was a potentially desperate situation, he only took men that had sons, and sons that could succeed them. So there was an expectation that there was a good chance that they would lose. So they knew from the beginning that this wasn't a high probability of winning. They actually held off for quite a while and did better than they thought they were going to do. And the reason that they were able to do this has to do with the tactics that they used, along with the location. So with the location, they found a mountain pass, that had a small opening, and they could direct the forces, the Persian forces, to that opening. That's where they set up, and so this limited the number of Persians that could attack at any one time, which of course helped when you have a smaller force against a much larger force. And they used it with the Phalanx Formation. They held it really well. Ultimately, though, they go away there. There we go. Sorry about that. I was showing the speaker. They held out for quite a while until the story is that they were betrayed. Now, this is not entirely uncommon, that some people, if they felt like there was a lost cause, you would go over to the other side and say, look, I see the light, that you're clearly going to win. Here's the information I can give you so that, me or my people or whoever will be treated fairly. So someone gave them, the Persians, way behind the soldiers. Before this happened, though, you do have that most of the Greeks, besides the Spartans, left. They saw that the route was compromised, and so then that left the 300 Spartans, and so then the Spartans held out by themselves for quite a while still, until they died. and then that's where you get the Battle of Thermopylae with the 300 Spartans. The problem is that while the Battle of Thermopylae was successful in terms of not winning the battle, but holding them off, the naval battle that was supposed to accompany it and direct the Persians where they wanted them to go did not work. And then there was also some issues with weather, and all of that led to the Persians not going to the location that they wanted. So this created a new problem, specifically with Athens, and then what becomes the Battle of Salamis. Athens has to make a decision because now Persia's coming towards Athens. So that was not where they wanted them to go. And they could either defend Athens and stop the plan that they had for the Strait of Salamis. So their goal was the Strait of Salamis. And the reason for the Strait of Salamis is that it was a narrow area. And of course it would be a naval battle, which Athens was good at. And because it was narrow, the smaller triremes, the smaller ships of Athens, would have a benefit. I cannot speak. Apologies. The benefit compared to Persians' larger ships, that they would be able to move around and be more maneuverable, and ideally attack faster than the larger ships that could get stuck in the strait itself. So you have this dilemma, right? Do we stay and defend Athens, or do we continue to try to move our plan to the Strait of Salamis, which is what they wanted to do? They decide that they are going to stick with their original plan. So they abandon Athens and allow it to go to Xerxes, who destroys part of the city. But this works into their new plan, which is to make him think that he is winning, which he kind of is anyway at this point, so that wasn't a far stretch. But the goal was to make Xerxes extra confident. In fact, this later gets told in terms of the reason for Xerxes' downfall was hubris. Remember, we talked about the major themes in Greece with the Odyssey and Iliad, and one of them was hubris, excessive pride. And this gets told by the Greeks later that Xerxes lost the Persian Wars because of his hubris, because he had excessive pride and was overly confident that he had somehow accomplished all of this and became careless because of that excessive pride. So they definitely saw that in those terms with one of those themes that way. So they abandon Athens, make Xerxes extra confident. He goes in and destroys part of the city, and is feeling like he is winning, because he is. So their next goal is they have to hurry up, and they're almost done finishing up the ships. They had to abandon Athens, not only so they didn't force all of their time defending Athens, but that they could get the ships into position that the Battle of Thermopylae had the Spartans had sacrificed themselves for, to hold off so those ships would be ready. So part of the plan had worked. The ships were ready, but they had to get them into position, and they wouldn't be able to do that if they held Athens. So the Athenians sacrificed Athens. Again, most of the people had fled, but they sacrificed Athens in order to do this. Then they had a general that went to Xerxes and said, basically, it worked with the Battle of Marathon. So they figured it would work here. He claimed that he was defecting, and he saw the writing on the wall as well, and he had important information. And that important information was that the Athenians were not done building their ships. The ships were incomplete, and they were incomplete in the Strait of Salamis. Now, of course, this was not true. They had finished them because of the delay in the Battle of Thermopylae, and were moving them into position. But the general said, Xerxes, look, clearly you just conquered Athens, you've destroyed the city, we're gonna lose. I don't want to die. I'm defecting to you, and here's my information. And that is, if you go to the strait, and the goal of what he was telling him is he needed to go right away, right? Because if he delayed, then the ships would be finished. But if he went right away, he could catch them still finishing building the ships and dock, and he could utterly destroy them. And not surprisingly, right, Xerxes believed him, in part because, it had worked out in the Battle of Thermopylae, and in part because, again, these things did happen. It wasn't unexpected or weird that someone would defect when it looked like they were losing poorly. And so Xerxes rushed to the Strait of Salamis, where, to his surprise, the ships were not incomplete, but the Athenian ships were waiting for him. And it did exactly what they hoped, which was it moved him into a narrow space for the Persian ships. So the Persian ships were much larger, and they couldn't move around as well as the Athenian triremes. This allowed the Athenian ships to not only attack and the ships faster and maneuver around them, but they were able to set some on fire as well. This was a complete devastation or loss for Persia. This was a major important battle in terms of changing the direction of the war. Xerxes actually left after this and went back to Persia. This is significant because Persian kings didn't always go to all the fights. Instead, they would go to the most important battles, the ones that were either dangerous, that they were in danger of losing, or the big culmination battle that they thought they were going to win. Often Persian kings let their generals take care of that, and again, didn't participate in a lot of the battles. Xerxes had been at Athens and then went to the Battle of Salamis, and then him going back to Persia, while there's one more battle after this, signals to the rest of the soldiers that he's essentially assessing that the battle is done at this point. They do have another major battle that takes place, the Battle of Plataea, and this was a land battle. And the Battle of Plataea was both Athenian and Sparta, although there were other Greeks too. But the major two forces were Athens and Sparta. And Sparta did take the lead on this one, and they were successful in routing the remaining Persian army. And, again, because Xerxes had already left and taken back some of his forces, it was not seen as one that was close. However, they still had a lot of men. So if they had won the Battle of Plataea, the Persians, that could have changed the war altogether, again in the opposite direction. This is the last battle. So while often the Battle of Salamis is seen as the most important. Well, usually the Battle of Thermopylae and the Battle of Salamis are seen as the most important ones because those really dictated what happened. The very last battle was the Battle of Plataea, and it was one that they actually worked the best together on, fighting together side by side. So that's the end of the Persian War. Persia is defeated, which people, were shocked at that these Greek city-states came together and with much smaller forces defeated what was seen as often an undefeatable army, an undefeatable force. And this is then going to lead to the Peloponnesian Wars not long after. What's interesting with this is right at the end of this of the Persian Wars, Athens and Sparta are at their height of power. They not only were incredibly wealthy before this, but now have these major military victories that united the Greek city-states in seeing themselves and identifying as kind of this Hellenic body. Of course, there are concerns that Persia will try again. That this, just like the first Persian War, that it's only a matter of time, and this is going to create some tensions between the two groups. So we'll look at that. Just for facts though, the Peloponnesian War was a 30-year war. And it lasted from 431 to 404 BCE. And there were 3 phases to the war. So while it was a 30-year war, there were phases. So there was some downtime in between that. The first was the Archimedean War, which was from 431 to 421 BCE. And then the next phase was the Peace of Nicaea, which lasted from 421 to 413. And then the final phase of war was the Ionian War. And that one lasted from 413 to 404 BCE. Okay, so that, important to know as far as that there were a couple different phases of the war. It wasn't one long continuous war. Nonetheless, it is going to have devastating consequences for the overall outcome of really Sparta and Athens and Greece. It's going to change the trajectory of how it develops and allows for the Macedonians under Philip and then his son Alexander to take over, because they end up in a fully weakened state. You not only have the Persian Wars that took a lot out of them, but then you're going to end up having this 30-year period of phases of wars where they deplete all their resources. So you have the two main powers that emerge out of this, right? Athens and Sparta. And from the beginning, they end up competing over who was more influential with the war. They both claimed credit for the victory over Sparta. Right? The Athenians claimed their ships, and the Battle of Plataea, or the Battle of Salamis, was the decisive victory, and the Spartans said Thermopylae, and specifically the Battle of Plataea, was theirs. So, well, in Athens also Marathon. So Athens said, well, we only won because of Marathon and Salamis, and the Spartans said, no, we only won because of Thermopylae and Plataea. And so they, from the beginning, they start arguing over this, and you know, kind of any unification, while there's more identification as Hellenic, there's immediately jealousy and conflict that begins to take place. So one of the first things that happens that's going to lead to the conflict is that Sparta is going to ask Athens not to rebuild their city walls. And you might think, well, why do they, why not have them build their city walls? Now, what they claim is that, look, if Persia comes back and they actually conquer the city rather than destroy it, then Athens becomes this fortification for Persia. And that would be bad. So that was the Spartans' argument, is that the Persians could use Athens as a fortified base. But then the Athenians realized really quickly that their argument was of Persians using walls for fortified base was not legit. Instead, it was because Sparta wanted to have control. And the way that they would have control is that if there were no walls, Sparta could always use the threat of invasion, because the reality is that no one was really able to stand against the Spartans on land. They were just better hoplite soldiers. They were professional soldiers. And so the Athenians saw this ruse from the beginning, that no, Sparta's just want it because if we don't have walls, then they could easily come take us over at any time, and they could use that as a threat. So what they did is they stalled, essentially. They said, crap, we have to hold them off long enough to quickly build the Athenian walls, so that we can defend ourselves if Sparta decides to attack. So they sent Themistocles, who was a diplomat, a well-known diplomat, and he went to Sparta, where he did a brilliant job at stalling them for a while. While he was stalling them, Athens got everyone in the city, all their citizens, well, it wasn't even just citizens, it was women and others too, all the people, to quickly build the walls. So by the time that Sparta realized that they were just being held off, and he was making up excuses, the construction was almost complete when the Spartans realized what was going on, and they were pissed at this, incredibly so, which is these tensions are going to lead to war. It's this, along with the Athenian Delian League, that is created. So what was going on? They were angry. The brilliant aspect of the walls was that they planned for a long invasion with the walls. So if you had Athens here, let's say this is the main city, and here was the ocean, what they did is they built a series of walls that allowed them to have it's a little bit further than it was, but if you had the ocean here, they built a series of walls so they could have access to the sea, so that they could have their ships out here waiting, and that this provided supply to the city. Why this is important from this design is it allows for a siege, so that you can stay in the walls, because part of the issue with a siege is that you starve them out. But if you have access to water and food, then you can hold out indefinitely. I mean, we saw the Trojan War, right? It lasted for 10 years because Troy had access to supplies and water and really good walls. So they were very smart about how they built their wall to specifically prepare for the potential of a Spartan siege by land, because they knew the Spartans weren't good with the navy. A naval force, right, was not what Sparta was going to do, which they're not going to. What Sparta is going to end up doing is attacking everything else that isn't in the city, and then waiting and camping around, hoping that they can goad Athens to come out. So while this is going on, the Athenians essentially plan to solidify their control as best as they can through the Delian League. The Delian League was both meant to establish control and power, as well as provide a force against Sparta. Now, that's not what they claimed it as, though. Instead, what they claimed is that it was a league that was being created to protect against Persia coming back and attacking again. And they played on the other city-states' fears that would happen, and said, you never know, they've already come back before, you guys can't hold out against them on your own, you need us. And so they convinced several city-states to join the league against the Persians, and the goal and the purpose is that, just like the Hellenic League, these city-states would pay taxes, and these taxes would go to Athens, who would build ships, and the ships would be used for the collective defense of Greece against Persia if they invaded again. Now, initially, how it worked is that each city-state had a representative in the league. So that it was meant to be seen, and it's probably that Athens didn't plan initially to become a full-fledged empire where these people in the league eventually become tributary states, but it's what it becomes, right? The Delian League starts out as, and probably had some intent of both force against Sparta and Persia. It probably was a combination, not just we need to defend against Sparta and we're going to make these tributary states, but we're not going to tell them they're tributary states. Instead, we're going to make them think they're part of the league, like the Hellenic League. And each state had a representative, and they exchanged oaths to the whole process that they would remain loyal to each other and in the defense of Greece against Sparta. They did meet annually on Delos, where they talked about policy and rules and progress and everything else. Each representative had a vote, but the key is that Athens was always the chairman, and this is going to give them the ability to remain in control. Besides the fact that they got all the money, the other members didn't want to construct the ships, and Athens was the best at it. And so, while it wasn't technically, Athens wasn't technically given the money, it was actually deposited in the temple of Apollo. But they had control of the money because they were the ones building the ships. And ultimately Athens had an extra vote as chairman, so this allows them to eventually take over. So it's not surprising that this will eventually lead to an Athenian empire, and the people in the city-states in the Delian League being the tributary states. Again, it doesn't start out that way, but it is. They're gonna force them to stay. Essentially, once as some years go by, and then people are like, hey, you know, the Persians haven't come back, and you kind of seem to be fighting with Sparta, but I don't see a Persian threat. We don't want to be in the league anymore. We're good. And Athens was like, no. And they're like, what? No, you don't get to leave. Well, we're part of the league. We don't want to be. Nope, sorry, that you're stuck. And then a city-state that tried to leave or revolt at this point, Athens invaded and overthrew brutally. So from the Delian League, Athens does become an empire, and these city-states become a tributary state. Although, again, it takes a little bit of time to move into that. They did a good job of a slow change. And in part, that did happen because, so one of the questions is, well, maybe it wouldn't have happened if Athens and Sparta hadn't officially gone to war. But because they did, it shifted into what it became. So the first phase of war, the Archimedean War, this war was testing in many ways how they were going to fight. The main leader of Athens was Pericles, and his strategy was that, hey, we cannot fight Sparta on land. Like, it's just not going to happen. And so instead, here was strategy. He said, we need to stay behind the walls. And we'll keep the subject city-states that were part of the Delian League paying with the fleet. Nope. With their navy, right? And we can supply the city with the navy, right? Which is why they created, like, hey, we created these walls for a purpose. We should be using it because we will get destroyed otherwise. So Sparta shows up, and because they end up getting fed up with the whole thing, the arguments and fights break out into war. So Sparta shows up, and they essentially invade Attica. And while they're invading Attica, they burn crops and homes. They plunder. And they continued this until outside the Athens walls. What had happened because of under Pericles is, right, everyone ends up, as the Spartan military starts moving, in the Athenian walls. And then they just camped out there until winter. Most wars in the world would fight in spring and fall, and then at winter, you took a break. Mostly this idea that it wasn't realistic to survive winter, nor did people want to. So you'd fight, and then at winter, everyone would go their separate ways, and then after winter was over, you resumed the fighting again. And this was happening all the way through the Revolutionary War. It was a common thing to do. But while they waited, they would taunt and harass the Athenian citizens. They would call them wimps and cowards, and the Athenians didn't like it. Then they would return the next year and do the same thing. So you didn't have any time to rebuild. You didn't have time to, if you planted crops outside, they were just going to be plundered and burned. And this happened year after year. The Pericles, like I said, was well liked at first. And as long as the grain shipments kept coming from the Black Sea and other areas to the city, Sparta couldn't defeat Athens because they didn't have siege tactics. The Athenians had to be held back at times to not go attack, right? Because the issue with this tactic is that it is tedious and difficult on people because they're trapped essentially inside the walls. And it's not it does become physically difficult, but it's also mentally. People didn't like that they weren't fighting. There were arguments that it was they were weak and that this was not the right tactic to use, that ultimately how could they just sit there and not fight. And people began to resent Pericles because they saw that his tactics were why we're still here. And many began to say we could defeat Sparta, which they couldn't. but the idea was, like, we're just stuck here and we could really defeat them if we would just fight. Pericles won't let us fight. Right, it's all Pericles' fault. Poor Pericles, he got blamed and for all this. And the reality is his tactic was sound. It was difficult, and I'm not sure eventually what Sparta would he didn't have an end goal. So there was his problem. This worked, but there was no end goal to defeat Sparta. So how long do you live like this? And that was problematic. So what changes it to where, besides just the general resentment that was leading to people not liking Pericles, is that there was a plague that broke out, right? Anytime you have a large group of people in a small area for a long period of time, you're going to end up with diseases eventually. And that's what happened here, is that a plague broke out because of the crowding and sanitary conditions. Now, it wasn't horrible because they had food and water. Nonetheless, so many people, so many refugees that came in from the different raids and stuff from Sparta, it led to disease. And in the summer of 430, a plague broke out. This devastated plague broke out. This devastated the city, and not surprisingly, the Athenians turned on Pericles and blamed him for the plague too, which really wasn't his fault. And they dismissed him and he was no longer general. They were looking, and part of this was morale, right? They were looking for some other tactic that could make them feel like that they would be good. That Pericles was the person they targeted. So their new strategy was to attack Sparta, right? Well, or fight Sparta. Ultimately, this did not go well. And they returned to Pericles' plan. However, unfortunately for Pericles, in any type of, we're sorry, you were right, we suck at fighting Sparta on their own terms on land, he died from the plague. And so after his death, the war of trying to make raids and attacks was abandoned, and they instead, and trying to outlast Sparta, they decided that the only way was going to be to destroy Sparta. So what this did learn was, right, limited raids where you attack on land were not going to work. And they did, and outlasting Sparta wasn't going to be good for morale, and people weren't going to put up with it. Wasn't going to work either. So then they said, we have to come up with a new plan that allows us to actively destroy them. This is going, and both, well, what's interesting is both them and Sparta was getting frustrated from this as well. And so they actually both end up looking for new strategies to, I think we're on D here, to fight the war. So Sparta is like, well, we keep, attacking the wall, and that's not doing anything. So let's try to have a naval battle and see if that works. They end up borrowing the Corinthian fleet in hopes of fighting the Athenian fleet. And this showcases Sparta's lack of naval skill. What ends up happening is the Athenian fleet encircles them because they end up staying too close. And they're able to just sail around and around. And the Corinthian ships back up basically to each other and crash into each other. So what happens is essentially you end up with the Spartan ships, well, the Corinthian ships that are by Sparta, in a circle like this with their backs to each other, and they keep moving closer and closer until they crash into each other, while the Athenian ships just moved around on the outside, and they could make quick attacks and dash in and dash out. And just showcase, right, that the Spartans, they got wiped out. Sparta did not try ships again. Not this way. They are going to use ships to transport for battle. But the Spartans are not going to try a naval engagement after that. They're like, yeah, we're definitely not a naval force. Let's just not try that again. So that's what Sparta tried, and then decided, screw that. We'll just use ships to transport our troops places, but we are not engaging in battles. Pericles' successors became more aggressive in hopes of actively destroying Sparta. Demosthenes was the next leader, who hoped to use new allies that they had gained to defeat Sparta. And their move was to actively, get allies, whether that was by choice or force, and then aggressively attack Sparta. Now, the way that they wanted to do this was to find areas that they could sail to, and then do raids by land. What I want to look at before we get into the structure of this and what they did is two of the sources that showcase especially the allies by choice and force, and then Pericles' funeral speech. So there were two sources, like I said, Pericles' funeral speech, right? So that's before he died, obviously. And then The other one that I had you read was with the dialogue, the Melian dialogue. And this is a good example of that forced ally situation that showcases how Athens had changed. So one of the things we're going to look with this is, so we'll come over here and we'll take a break from what Demosthenes did specifically with the tactics and look at, with Pericles' funeral speech, what we're going to look at it is kind of the goal of how Athens saw themselves, what they valued. This was a funeral speech, as it's titled, that Pericles gave after several battles and dead from that earlier period, right, where they were, I mean, they stayed behind the walls, but it didn't mean that they didn't occasionally engage Sparta. And then you also had the plague that broke out before Pericles eventually gets the plague. And so he gives this big funeral speech, and it gives you an idea of what they saw, how they saw themselves and what they valued. Obviously, there's going to be an emphasis on democracy and what that meant. And then you have the Melian dialogue, which was the conversation recorded with the people of Milos, who Athens wanted to be part of the Delian League, and they didn't want to be, and Athens said, too bad. And they forced them to either be in it or be destroyed. And the reason for it was because some of the other people in the now Athenian Empire that were part of the Delian League were like, hey, we didn't sign up to be tributary states. We want out. And one had revolted. And so they said, we can't leave these other areas neutral. Sparta had created their own league, the Peloponnesian League, and so they were trying to make sure Sparta didn't want Sparta to get more city-states for their league. And they wanted to show that they were strong. And so this is the dialogue that took place before Athens actually destroyed them. And what I want you to think about with this is the contrast between Athens as a democracy and their ideal that we see with Pericles' funeral speech, and Athens as an empire, right? Because they're very different. So we're going to take a look at those two, and then we will come back with Demosthenes and stuff. But that fits in with, like I said, the allies not giving them choice. Pericles' funeral speech was a little bit before that, but the Melian dialogue was around that time. So I'm going to pull those up, and then we will take a look. All right, so the first one, Pericles' funeral speech. I want to look at a couple points where he talks about, again, this is a funeral speech for those who had died. He's basically listing out the good qualities of Athens. So, as well as putting digs at Sparta throughout. Our constitution does not copy the laws of neighboring states. We are rather a pattern to others than imitators ourselves. Its administration favors the many instead of the few. That is why it is called a democracy. If we look to the laws, they afford equal justice to all in their private differences. If no social standing, advancement in public life falls to reputation for capacity, class considerations not being allowed to interfere with merit, nor does poverty bar the way. If a man is able to serve the state, he is not hindered by the obscurity of his condition. The freedom which we enjoy in our government extends also to our ordinary life. So here you have this idea of the government and touting democracy as for all, right? It's by merit, and it doesn't matter your social standing or your wealth. And then that freedom also is in everyday life as well. This is the jab at Sparta. Far from exercising a jealous surveillance over each other, we do not feel called upon to be angry with our neighbors for doing what he likes, or even to indulge in those injurious looks which cannot fail to be offensive. So this was a dig at Sparta, saying Sparta spends all their time not only policing themselves but others. We don't have to fall to that at all, right? Further, we provide plenty of means for the mind to refresh itself from business. We celebrate games and sacrifice all the year round, and the elegance of our private establishments forms a daily source of pleasure and helps to banish the spleen, while our city draws the produce of the world into our harbor, right? So we're fun and wealthy, right? We've got stuff in our city, things are good, people can enjoy themselves. If we turn to our military policy, there also we differ from our antagonist, which is again Sparta. We throw open our city to the world and never by alien acts exclude foreigners from any opportunity of learning or observing, although that could go against us, right? While in education, where our rivals from their very cradles by a painful discipline seek after manliness, at Athens we live exactly as we please, and yet are just as ready to encounter every legitimate danger. Again, another dig at Sparta, right? Sparta from the very beginning is only about manliness and stuff, whereas we focus on education and having people have the freedom to do what they want. Again, one of the key words with this is freedom. Athens and democracy creates a sense of freedom. Right, proof of this is that, the Spartans don't invade our country alone, but bring with them all their confederates, while we Athenians advance unsupported into the territory of our neighbor, and fighting against others, vanquish with ease men who are defending their home. So this means we're good soldiers, right? That's part of it too, where Sparta uses others as well, right? We're all by ourselves. You had the Delian League, which was financing them. They may not have been using other soldiers all the time, but they definitely had a league as well. But it sounds better, right, in that sense. Of we're doing this all on our own. Everyone wants to come see us. We open ourselves to the world. We have the freedom for this, right? And then he says a little bit later, in short, I say that as a city, we are the school of Hellas. And that's the idea of that they're the example of the Hellenic world. Indeed, if I have dwelt at some length upon the character of our country, it has been to show that our stake in the struggle is not the same as theirs, who have no such blessings to lose. So that's the idea too, right, is that the Athenian way of life is more valuable, is better, because of all of these things that he just talked about. And then here's the idea with this, right? So died these men as became Athenians. There was the idea with this that he was saying right before it, actually. Thus choosing to die resisting rather than to live submitting, they fled only from dishonor, but met danger face to face, and after one brief moment, while at the summit of their fortune, escaped not from their fear, but from their glory. So this is the idea that they died for a purpose, right? They chose to resist rather than to submit, and so died these men as became Athenians, right? Those are Athenians. And then he says to the people, the family members there, comfort, therefore, not condolence, is what I have to offer to the parents of the dead who may be here. So he said, instead of condolences, I'm going to offer comfort, because numberless are the chances to which, as they know, the life of man is subject. But fortunate indeed are they who draw for their lot a death so glorious as that which has caused your mourning, and to whom life has been so exactly measured as to have terminated in happiness in which it's been passed. Essentially what it's saying is, instead of condolence of sorry, I'm going to offer you comfort in knowing that they got to live as Athenians. And they got to experience all of these freedoms, right? They died protecting that, and they got to experience that, which is such a better fate and option than if they had never experienced that at all. So the key with Pericles' funeral speech is this idea of highlighting what was important in democracy. The government, the laws, the freedom, the equality which they're putting out, the quality of life, but that they were still a strong group. It's really this, that freedom of democracy equal to good quality of life, and that's what Athens had to offer. And that they were an example to everyone else in the Hellenic world. And that ultimately Athenian life is better, and that you should be proud and take comfort in knowing that your sons got to experience this great way of life. Whether that's somewhat condescending, but this does a really good job of showcasing that what they valued about democracy. The next one, the Melian dialogue. So this, again, they went to this isn't under Demosthenes, this is just a little bit later, but it showcases what I was talking about with the forcing allies or forcing people to become allies or fighting them. So again, the attack on Milos happened during the second phase, the Peace of Nicaeus. But this is the one we have that documents that idea of what they were doing. And so take into example what we just looked at with what they were showcasing as the highlights of democracy, and then how this is playing out, right? So they go to Milos and they say, look, we're here, and we can have a conversation about what's going to happen, or we can attack you. And so then it starts with right here, let's see. Let us have no set speeches at all, but do you reply to each several statements of which you disapprove and criticize it at once? Say first of all how you like this mode of proceeding. So this is the Athenians. And they're saying, can we sit down and have a conversation? Right? Rather than just attack. And the Melian response is, the quiet interchange of your explanations is a reasonable thing, and we do not object to that. But your warlike movements, which are present not only to our fears but to our eyes, seem to belie your words. We see that although you may reason with us, you mean to be our judges, and that at the end of discussion, if the justice of our cause prevail and therefore refuse to yield, we may expect war if we are convinced by you slavery. So the Milos say basically we have two options, war or slavery, right? That's what you're giving us. Because they're like, well, you sound reasonable that you want to sit down and have this face-to-face conversation, which is what the Athenians had set up at the beginning. But it sounds like, based on all your warlike movements, that you're only giving us two options, either to fight you or to be your slaves. And then they kind of chide them, the Athenians chide them and stuff. So then it goes to, okay, well, we Athenians will use no free words. Basically, we're going to get straight to the point. We will not go out of our way to prove at length that we have a right to rule because we overthrew the Persians, or that we attack you now because we are suffering any injury at your hands. We should not convince you if we did. So they're saying, look, we're not going to argue that we have a right to rule because we defeated the Persians, or that we somehow suffered some, issue at your hands. No, we're not. That's not, because that's not the case, and we're not going to convince you. Nor must you expect to convince us by arguing that although a colony of Lacedaemonians, which is Sparta, you have taken no part in their expeditions, or that you have never done us any wrong. So we're not going to try to convince you we have a right to rule or you've done injury to us, and don't try to convince us that even though you're a colony of the Spartans, that you've done nothing to us. We're going to say what we really think. And aim for what's possible. For we both alike know that into discussion of human affairs, the question of justice only enters where the pressure of necessity is equal, and that the powerful exact what they can, and the weak grant what they must. So this is important here. What are they saying? That justice only enters the equation when people are equal. Otherwise, the powerful take what they can, and the weak grant what they must. Now, does that sound like democracy and what the Pericles was just touting? Not really. I mean, this is the exact opposite. Now, again, Pericles' funeral speech is in time is a little bit earlier. It's in the first phase of war, and technically this dialogue is in the second phase, the Peace of Nicaea. However, they were practicing this at the end of the first phase of the war anyway. But it's a start. It's why I put these two documents in, because it's such a stark contrast. In one case, you have that democracy and freedom and equality and freedom and yay and life is great, and then in this one you have justice only happens when people are equal. Otherwise, the powerful take what they can, and the weak must grants what they must. That's like, that line is the best line for showcasing how Athens has become an empire. And while they may still be practicing democracy in Athens, for Athenians, the whole concept of what they're touting as democracy obviously applies to no one else. And then they're like, well, in that case, what's our choice? And then they try. So the Melians are like, oh, crap. That doesn't leave us with much option. So then they tried to say, your interest in this principle is quite as great as ours, insomuch as you, if you fall, you will incur the heaviest vengeance and will be the most terrible example to mankind. They're like, look, you've got this on the line, because if you fall, the Spartans, the vengeance will be horrible. And they say, no. The Athenians, the fall of our empire, if it should fall, is not an event to which we look forward with dismay. For ruling states such as Lacedaemon, Spartans, right, are not cruel to their vanquished enemies. And we are fighting not so much against them as against our own subjects, who may someday rise up and overcome their former masters. The danger in which you leave to us. And we will now endeavor to show that we have come in the interest of our empire, and that in what we are about to say, we are only seeking the preservation of your city, for we want to make you ours with the least trouble to ourselves. So they're saying, actually, no, we're not really concerned about falling to the enemy and the end of our empire. In fact, our own subjects are more of a danger, right? Revolt from subjects. And that's what we're concerned about. And that we're here. Our goal is to preserve your city because we want to make you ours. Not you, not make you independent. We would rather not destroy you. So they're basically coming and saying, look, our goal is we would prefer that you would submit so that we don't have to destroy this city. Because that's best for us. But it's not about the people. They don't care about them at all. It may be your interest to be our master. Oh, this is not the Athenians, it's the Milos. It may be your interest to be our masters, but how can it be ours to be your slaves? They're like, yeah, okay, we get it. It's your best interest if you conquer us, but why would that be in our interest? To you, the gain will be that by submission you will avert the worst, and we shall be all the richer for your preservation. So basically saying, by submitting, we don't destroy you. That's it. But must we be your enemy? Will you not receive us as friends if we are neutral and remain at peace with you? No, your enmity is not half so mischievous to us as your friendship. For the one For the one is in the eyes of our subjects as argument of our power, the other our weakness. So here's what they're saying. No, you being an enemy is good. Friendship is weakness to their subjects, right? Basically saying, like, if we let you stay neutral, the others will revolt because they'll think we're weak. We're better off having you as an enemy that we destroy than showing you, leniency. So this is what Athens had become. And it's very different from how they saw themselves in Athens as a democracy. None of that's obvious. None of that ideology of freedom of democracy and equality is present in the Melian dialogue at all. They're fully an empire to everyone else, and they become somewhat brutal by this period. Okay, and part of that reason for that has to do with the end of this period is that both sides become more and more brutal in a kind of desperate attempt to win the war in that first phase. So let's pull that back here. So under Demosthenes, coming back to that for a minute, you do have both sides become more brutal in war. You have a lot more deaths and people willing to slaughter whole groups. The Athenians did it. They're going to do it with the Melians later during the Peace of Nicaea, but they had taken over other people and ordered them to be killed. Any kind of slaughtered whole groups and put down revolts. The Spartans began to fear Helot revolts. And so what they did is they actually gathered the Helots and had this whole charade of asking who was most loyal. And then the people who stepped forward are selected. And remember, the Helots were the serfs who stepped forward or selected. They put on this whole play and charade, like they pretended they were going to free them. And then they killed them all. And the reason for this was that they believed that, so they didn't kill all the Helots, they killed the ones that, claimed to be most loyal, that they were the ones that were most likely to revolt. So both sides became more brutal. Eventually, what happened is that both sides ended up exhausting resources, and so money, resources, and manpower became short. In fact, the Spartans had significantly dwindling numbers, and it was getting incredibly bad. So what happens from that is, let's see, what number were we on with that? I guess F, is that they agree to a type of truce, which becomes the Peace of Nicaea. So it was a peace, kind of. The truce is a better word for it. And not everyone agreed to it. It was a period of, so they had some skirmishes of mostly no fighting. But there was some continued fighting on and off, and not everyone agreed with the policy. This ended with Alcibiades, who was made the leader of Athens, when he ended up going and attacking Milos what was the Melian dialogue we just looked at. So really short, but that's just mostly because it was a period of less fighting. It was a tentative truce. No one fully agreed to end everything. But ultimately restarted right with the Ionian Wars. And this period, I'm not gonna get, we're already longer than I wanted to be with length. The key with the Ionian Wars is that you had, this was a last desperate attempt by both sides. They both were running out of supplies and men, and all of this led to extreme loss of manpower and money. The Athenians constantly had spent all of their money on their ships, and they were on their last fleet. They had no more money to build more ships. So that's going to be part of the problem when they lose that in a battle. The Spartans were dangerously low in numbers, to the point that the Spartans ended up surrendering in one battle, which they never did, because they realized that if they fought to the death, there would be almost no Spartan soldiers left. So you have this, like I said, extreme period of desperation, essentially. What happens with this is reactions to this desperation. The Athenians end up creating an oligarchy of 400. So they abandon the democratic system, and they were supposed to, with the oligarchy of 400, form a new government. That was their job. That's why they created them. Instead, they're like, we kind of like being in power. And so while they were supposedly, planning to figure out how to come to power, they executed their enemies. And confiscated property. And ended certain rights of citizens. So the whole democratic system in Athens, this is Athens, right, is gone at this point. Where at least you could say with Pericles' funeral speech and the Melian dialogue, maybe they're still democratic in Athens, but they treat everyone else different. Now you had a government system that was no longer democratic. For the Spartans, their desperation led them to ask Persia for money and assistance. So, the whole Persian War and fighting there was their desperation. That they said they needed, they were willing to ask Persia for help. Persia was like, oh, you want our help? Well, sure, we'll do this. I mean, it was seen as feudal. They agreed in this for Persian aid, that Sparta, or that Persia would get back the Ionian city-states, which after the Persian Wars they had lost. Which, of course, they didn't consult the Ionian city-states if that's what they wanted. And that was their condition. And in return, they got gold and support. and they took it. And that was seen as like the ultimate betrayal of agreeing to have Persia help them regain their power. When Athens, main reaction and sacrifice was to get rid of the democracy altogether. Ultimately, who wins? The Spartans win. And they win because of attrition and a final mistake by Athens. So one of the things is that, right, Athens was out of money and ships. And Sparta, while they were low on men, they did have Persian money and support. So that allowed them to last longer than Athens. The other thing that played into it was this final mistake. The Athenian navy, we'll put it in quotation marks at this point because it was a few ships. That's all they had left, was patrolling. And they ended up setting and beaching the ships. And this was technically in Athenian territory, but Spartans were nearby. What was interesting is that previous general, our leader, Alcibiades, lived in the area. And Alcibiades went, and so he was no longer the leader right at this point because now it was the oligarchy. Alcibiades lived near where they beached the ships. And he said, hey guys, you do know that there are Spartan ships and forces not that far away. And so he warned them, maybe you shouldn't beach the ships because that you can't get away quickly if they show up. And they basically said, shut up, Alcibiades, you're not in charge anymore. And wouldn't you know, the Spartans showed up and destroyed them. Then what they did is they left a few survivors to warn everyone else. Intentionally, with the idea that this would, with hearing that the final Athenian ships were destroyed, everyone would flee to Athens. And that this would create massive influx in resources used up, and it would starve them out of the city walls, which it did. And so then Athens surrendered. What's crazy is that both sides had opportunities to create a peace treaty way before this and chose not to. Again, the larger consequences of this were that it left, even though not Sparta in quotations, even though Sparta won, right, that win was nominal because they were left weak and with almost no resources. Both sides, basically, they depleted their control and power. This left them weak and vulnerable and allowed for the Macedonians under Philip Macedonians with Philip was able to invade after the Peloponnesian War with little resistance because no side had the capacity anymore to do anything. And then this will lead to Alexander the Great, who will take over for his father when his father's assassinated. All right, so that's it. Sorry it's a little bit longer than I wanted it to be, but lots going on there. The next one we're looking at is Alexander the Great and the philosophies and art from classical and Hellenistic period.